Today, I bring you a charming new mystery featuring none other than the brilliant Hercule Poirot, the world's most famous Belgian detective, created by Agatha Christie. This case is filled with twists, clever clues, and Poirot's signature little grey cells at work. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel this elegant puzzle together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now let's get started. It was one of those rare mornings when the English countryside appeared to be in a mood of unusual benevolence. The sun shone softly over the hedgerows, and the dew still clung to the blades of grass like forgotten silver. We had arrived the night before, Hercule Poirot and I, Captain Hastings, for what was meant to be a restorative weekend in the quiet village of Fernley Edge. I must confess, the air was invigorating. I strolled the garden paths of the Willowbank guest house with real pleasure, noting with satisfaction the plump roses and well-trimmed hedges. Poirot, however, had less enthusiasm for nature and more complaint about the arrangement of his pillows. "It is not restful," he muttered, fussing over the window curtains. "This, how do you call it? Draught. It blows directly upon the neck. I shall catch a chill, Hastings." "You'll be fine," I chuckled. "You could use a bit of country air. It's good for the constitution." "Pah, the constitution, yes, but not at the expense of the spinal alignment. The beds here, mon ami, are relics of torture." Mrs. Felicity Lowndes, our host and the proud owner of Willowbank, had greeted us warmly upon arrival. The guest house itself was a sprawling Victorian structure with ivy crawling up its stonework and a pleasant enough atmosphere for those who enjoyed the illusion of serenity. Poirot, however, saw beneath appearances. "You know, Hastings," he said as we sipped tea in the parlour that morning, "I am always suspicious when things appear too calm. It is like the surface of a pond. Beneath, something always stirs." At the time, I dismissed it as one of Poirot's poetic exaggerations. As it turned out, it was nothing of the sort. It was just after breakfast when Mrs. Lowndes approached Poirot with a request delivered in hushed tones and nervous glances. "Monsieur Poirot," she began, twisting her hands in front of her apron, "might I have a word with you? In private, if you please." Poirot set down his teacup and inclined his head graciously. "But of course, madame. Lead the way." I followed them into the small drawing room, curious. Mrs. Lowndes closed the door behind us and lowered her voice to a confidential whisper. "It's about my daughter-in-law, Evelyn," she said. "I wouldn't trouble you if it weren't, well, rather strange." Poirot steepled his fingers. "Strange? In what manner, madam?" "She's been talking in her sleep," Mrs. Lowndes said carefully. "At first I thought nothing of it. Everyone has dreams, don't they? But lately she's been saying things, names, phrases. Some of them, well, they're not right." Poirot's eyebrows lifted. "Not right, madam?" "She said the name Callum Marsh last night. That's the man who threw himself from the viaduct a month ago. You must have read about it. It was in all the local papers." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "And what connection does she have to this man?" Mrs. Lowndes hesitated. "None. At least none that I know of. Evelyn is a quiet girl, polite, gentle. She's only been married to my son Howard for a year, but lately she's seemed distant, as if she's not really here at all." Poirot exchanged a glance with me, then turned back to her. "You believe, madame, that there is more to this than mere dreams?" "I don't know what to believe," she said, "but it frightens me. And I thought, if anyone could make sense of it, it might be you." Poirot inclined his head again. "I thank you for your confidence, madame. And yes, perhaps there is something here that merits attention." We were introduced to Evelyn Louns that afternoon in the conservatory, where she sat with a book open in her lap, but her gaze fixed on the garden beyond the glass. She was a woman of quiet elegance, pale, with fine features, and a kind of remote beauty, as if she lived in some other realm entirely. "Mrs. Louns," Poirot said, bowing politely, "permit me to intrude. I am Hercule Poirot. Your mother-in-law has spoken to me of your recent nocturnal observations." Evelyn looked up slowly, blinking as if surfacing from a deep sleep. "Yes, I heard she might." She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I understand you have spoken certain names in your sleep," Poirot said gently. "Do you remember anything of these dreams?" She shook her head. "Nothing at all, only that I wake with a headache. It's as if my mind is doing things I haven't agreed to." "And the name Callum Marsh, does it mean anything to you?" She froze for a moment, just a flicker. But Poirot noticed it, as did I. "I've heard the name," she said softly. "In the newspapers. I didn't know him." Poirot said nothing for a moment, merely observing her with that intense gaze of his that could unravel secrets like threads from a tapestry. "You are troubled, madame," he said at last. "Not by the dreams, but by what they may reveal." Evelyn looked away. "Some things are best forgotten, Monsieur Poirot." "Ah," Poirot said softly, "but the mind, madame, it has a way of remembering what the heart wishes buried." As we took our leave, I leaned into Poirot and whispered, "Well? Do you think she's hiding something?" Poirot smoothed his moustache with care. "Hiding, Hastings? Non. She is drowning, in silence." I spent much of that afternoon strolling among the rose beds at the side of the guest house, quite convinced I had found paradise. The sun was warm but not overbearing. The scent of honeysuckle drifted lazily through the breeze, and the only sounds were the gentle chatter of birds and the occasional rustling of a hedgehog in the underbrush. "What a spot, eh, Poirot?" I called over my shoulder as I bent to sniff a particularly proud-looking bloom. Nothing like the countryside to clear the head. From a wicker chair beneath the shade of a cypress tree, Poirot looked unimpressed. His hat was perched at a careful angle, his cravat untouched despite the heat, and his expression was one of mild disdain. "Nature, Hastings," he murmured, "is a most unreliable companion. She is disorderly, chaotic, and full of insects." I laughed. "Come now, old man, surely even you can appreciate a bit of fresh air." He did not reply at once. Instead, he folded his arms and gazed intently at the upper windows of the guest house. I followed his line of sight and saw nothing out of the ordinary, just open curtains and clean panes. "I find it curious," he said at last, "that one speaks the secrets of the past while in the unconscious state, yet denies all knowledge of them when awake." "You mean Evelyn?" I asked. "Précisément. A mind at rest, and yet it betrays what the waking self refuses to confess. There is a tension here, mon ami, a delicate tension." I shrugged. "Probably nerves. Newlywed life, a large house, a rather overbearing mother-in-law." Poirot's moustache twitched. "Perhaps. But I do not believe in dreams that speak names of the dead without cause. There is more to Madame Evelyn than she herself knows." That night, long after the lights had dimmed and the corridors fallen silent, I found myself awakened by the faint creak of floorboards. I sat up in bed, half expecting Poirot to be conducting some midnight investigation, but he was still lying in the next bed, perfectly still and alert. "Do you hear it, Hastings?" he whispered. "I hear something," I whispered back. "Shh." We strained our ears. A muffled voice floated through the stillness, soft and dreamlike, coming from the room adjacent to ours. Evelyn's room. Poirot rose soundlessly, donning his dressing gown with surgical precision. I followed him into the corridor, where he pressed his ear to the door. "Don't touch the brooch," came the voice again. "He's watching." always watching. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Fascinant. There was a pause. Then the voice again, more urgent now. The train. No, not the train. He knows. Poirot stepped back, motioning me to follow. We returned to our room, and only when the door was closed behind us did he speak. She dreams, yes, he said, but these are not ordinary dreams. No. She recalls. Her mind replays the trauma. I blinked at him. What trauma? That, mon ami, is what we must discover. But you heard her. Do not touch the brooch. And more. He's watching. These are not abstract thoughts. These are warnings. You think someone's threatening her? Poirot nodded slowly. Or she believes she is being threatened. And belief, Hastings, is often the first indication that something, how do you say, is not right. He turned away and began to pace, fingertips pressed together in thought. Then, quietly, he added, There is something hidden in this house, Hastings. Something small, perhaps, but dangerous. And I, Hercule Poirot, intend to find it. The next morning dawned overcast, with a light drizzle dappling the windows of Willowbank guest house. The mood in the house matched the weather, quiet, watchful, as if the walls themselves held their breath. Poirot, ever punctual, had risen early and sat now at the breakfast table, impeccably dressed in grey, with a lilac cravat, nibbling at a croissant he had brought from London himself. English bread, he declared with disdain, is not bread. It is sponge masquerading as nourishment. I, on the other hand, had tucked heartily into bacon and eggs, and was rather enjoying the guest house's rustic charm. The Louns estate was old, but not decrepit. Solid oak furniture, faded but dignified rugs, and a curious number of locked cabinets and shuttered display cases. By 9:30, Poirot had requested, politely but firmly, to be shown around the house. Mrs. Lowndes obliged, her manner courteous but taut, like a woman performing under pressure. Is there a reason you keep the west wing locked? Poirot inquired as they passed a heavy wooden door. It's unused, she replied quickly. Just storage now. My late husband had a fondness for collecting things, books, paintings, that sort of thing. Ah, Poirot nodded. And Madame Evelyn? Which room is hers? The one above the garden, with the bay window, Mrs. Louns answered. She's still resting. The sleeping draught. Of course, Poirot said, and something passed in his eyes, an invisible calculation. He spent the next hour examining the drawing room, study and guest parlour, trailing his fingertips along window ledges and pausing to observe dust patterns on tabletops. He studied framed photographs on the mantel, wedding portraits, seaside holidays, and one curious image of Evelyn standing stiffly beside her husband, Howard, both of them oddly unsmiling. At last, we stood outside Evelyn's door. Poirot did not enter, merely stood, eyes closed, head tilted. Hastings, he murmured, do you feel it? Feel what? I asked. He opened his eyes. The air here, it is not light. It holds something heavy, something unsaid. This room, mon ami, is the centre of the web. Howard Lowndes was everything I expected from a successful man with polished shoes and inherited charm. He greeted Poirot with practised civility, all ease and perfect teeth, and offered us sherry even though it was barely past noon. I hear you've taken an interest in Evelyn's dreams, he said, swirling his glass. I can't say I blame you. They've been unsettling. Poirot sipped politely. She has spoken the name of Callum Marsh, a man recently deceased, no? Howard's brow furrowed, though the reaction seemed more rehearsed than real. Yes, terrible business. Local fellow, bit of a recluse. Suicide, wasn't it? You were in London the night Madame Evelyn first spoke the name, Poirot said casually. What took you there? Howard smiled. A business dinner. Property matters. I have the train tickets and a few witnesses if you need them. Poirot inclined his head. But of course, I never doubt a man with a good tailor and an alibi. That earned a chuckle, though Howard shifted slightly in his chair. What do you make of Evelyn's behavior, monsieur? Poirot continued. He shrugged. She's always been fragile, sensitive. I love her, of course, but she's had some dark spells before. I'm afraid the stress of the move and my mother's temperament haven't helped. Did she know Dr. Marsh? Not to my knowledge. Yet she speaks his name in sleep. Another pause. Fractional, but Poirot caught it. Howard set down his glass. Perhaps she read something in the papers. Evelyn is imaginative. She absorbs things. Poirot leaned forward, voice gentle. Or perhaps she remembers something she would rather forget. Howard's jaw tightened. You think she's hiding something? Poirot stood. Non, monsieur. I think she is trying to protect something, or someone. The room felt colder as we left. If Howard Louns embodied charm and self-assurance, his mother was a study in iron grace. Mrs. Felicity Lowndes had the kind of posture that reminded one of a governess or retired headmistress, upright, brisk, and more accustomed to giving orders than taking them. She received us in the morning room, pouring tea from a bone china set with unshaking hands. My daughter-in-law is not well, she began without preamble. She never has been, if you want the truth. Delicate nerves, poor appetite, anxious disposition. Poirot stirred his tea once, precisely. You did not mention these qualities when we first spoke. I was trying to be discreet. I don't like to gossip about family. But now, madame, you are prepared to speak plainly. She gave him a cool smile. You've already seen enough to draw conclusions, haven't you? Poirot tapped a teaspoon gently against the rim of his cup. Why do you believe Evelyn speaks of this man, Marsh? I don't know, and I don't like it. Perhaps she knew him, though she'd never admit it. There are gaps in her story. She never spoke of her life during the war. Not properly. That's where secrets breed. You believe she has something to hide. I believe she is not the innocent my son thought she was. And what of you, madame? Do you approve of this marriage? Her expression didn't change, but the answer was in her silence. Poirot gave a slight nod. And yet you remain under one roof. I am not a monster, Monsieur Poirot. I may not like her, but I would never harm her. She is my son's wife. Of course, Poirot said. And a mother would do anything to protect her son, anything at all. She did not answer, but I noticed her grip tighten just slightly around the delicate handle of her teacup. Gerard Venn was not the sort of man one noticed immediately. He moved quietly, spoke softly, and blended so thoroughly into the wallpaper of Willowbank guest house that I, for one, had quite forgotten he was even staying there. Poirot, of course, had not forgotten him in the slightest. We found Mr. Venn in the garden, hunched over a bed of pale lilies, with a notebook in one hand and a trowel in the other. His thick spectacles made his eyes appear owl-like, and his frame, though wiry, had the stooped weariness of a man more accustomed to solitude than society. Mr. Venn, Poirot greeted him. You are fond of the flowers, I see. Gerard blinked at us. Yes, nature is calming. Indeed. You are a botanist by profession, are you not? Retired, he said. Though one never truly retires from plants. Poirot smiled. And have you known the Louns family long? Venn shook his head. Only since I took the room, 6 months ago perhaps. They offered a long-term rate. Suited me well. And Madame Evelyn? Had you met her before she arrived here? The response was a fraction too slow. Number not that I recall. Poirot nodded but did not press further. Instead, we returned to the house, and it was then, during a quiet moment in Evelyn's room while she napped, that Poirot's eyes lit upon something curious on her writing desk. A pressed bloom, encased in thin parchment. A dried flower, he murmured. Wild chamomile. And see, here in small print, the label, Belli Perennis, G.V. His initials, I said, frowning. So he's given her flowers before. Poirot's voice was quiet. Not merely given. This is labelled, indexed, archived, you might say. Like a record from another time. Then he was lying. Not lying, Hastings, withholding. Which, as you well know, is often worse. He slid the flower carefully back beneath the paper. We must ask ourselves, mon ami, not why he gave her the flower, but why he now denies ever knowing her. Cecily Fairbairn had the sort of poise that immediately commanded attention. Slender, dark-haired, with a voice as smooth as her silk scarf, she exuded the polished charm of someone who had spent her life gliding through the drawing rooms of English country houses. Captain Hastings, she smiled when I introduced myself. And you must be the great Monsieur Poirot. I've heard of you, of course. Poirot inclined his head modestly. Madame, the pleasure is mine. We took tea in the garden, Cecily seated on a white iron chair that seemed far too delicate for daily use. Evelyn was still resting indoors, and Cecily took the opportunity to share what she called her observations about the household. Evelyn has always been sensitive, she said. It's why we got along so well. I was the bold one, she the gentle shadow. Poirot studied her carefully. You grew up together, oui. Yes, boarding school. We lost touch for a few years, then reconnected when she moved here. I was on a walking tour, happened to pass through the village. It was quite the coincidence. Coincidence? Poirot echoed, with that particular intonation of his that made it clear he didn't believe a word of it. I thought she might need a friend, Cecily continued. She didn't seem herself. All this sleep-talking nonsense. It's not like her. Poirot leaned forward. And yet, you came, you stayed, and you have not left. She laughed lightly. Do you suspect me, Monsieur Poirot? I suspect everyone, madame. It is the safest position. Cecily's eyes sparkled with amusement, but there was something else beneath it, something watchful. As we took our leave, Poirot whispered to me, You noticed it, Hastings. The smile, oui. But the eyes, they did not join in the performance. She is here for a reason. You think she's lying. I think, said Poirot, that Madame Cecily knows precisely which ghosts Evelyn has tried to bury, and perhaps she is here to dig them up. It was a grey afternoon, the kind that leached colour from even the brightest things. Rain tapped against the windows of Willowbank in an uneven rhythm, as though echoing a heartbeat growing steadily more uneasy. Poirot, for his part, appeared not to notice the weather at all. He was in one of his little grey cells moods, silent, still, and yet fiercely observant. I have asked Madame Evelyn's maid, Alice, to speak with us, he told me. It is often the one who dusts the vases who sees what the eyes of the family do not. Alice was a small, nervous creature with downcast eyes and ink-stained fingers. She entered the sitting room with trepidation, but perked up slightly when Poirot greeted her with old-world charm. My dear mademoiselle, he said, you must forgive the intrusion, but I have reason to believe that your observations may be of some importance. She blushed, nodded, and sat rigidly on the edge of the armchair. Poirot got to the point. Has Madame Evelyn been well of late? Alice hesitated. Not really, sir. She sleeps very badly. Talks sometimes, tosses and turns. I hear her through the wall. And has she ever spoken to you of fears, of threats? Her hands wrung the hem of her apron. Not directly, but I did find something strange. A note. Poirot's eyebrows lifted. A note? In her drawer. I wasn't snooping. I was just putting away the laundry. It was tucked under her handkerchiefs. She produced a folded scrap of paper from her pocket and handed it over. I read aloud. Stop asking questions or you'll regret it. Some things should stay buried. No signature. Poirot took the note delicately between two fingers, studying the slant of the handwriting. Typed, he murmured. Very wise, very deliberate. And there's something else, Alice said in a whisper. The brooch. The old family brooch, ruby, gold setting. It's gone missing from Madame Evelyn's jewellery box, and she doesn't know it. Poirot's eyes lit up. Ah, that is most interesting. Could it have been stolen? I asked. Or planted, Poirot replied. We must not forget the possibility of misdirection, Hastings. When a thing disappears, it is not always gone. It may only have been moved strategically. But why take a brooch? I asked. To frame someone, Poirot said. Or to silence them. He turned to Alice. And has anyone else shown unusual interest in Madame Evelyn's belongings? She glanced toward the door, then lowered her voice. Mrs. Lowndes was in her room once. Late. I thought it odd, but said nothing. Poirot nodded slowly. Merci, mademoiselle. You have done very well. As Alice left, Poirot turned back to me, the note still in his hand. We are walking through a fog, Hastings, but in every fog there are shapes, and I believe we are beginning to see their outlines. The following morning, the house was unusually quiet. I noticed it the moment I stepped out of my room. No soft humming from the kitchen, no gentle clatter of breakfast trays being prepared. Even the ever-alert Mrs. Lowndes was conspicuously absent from her usual command post in the parlour. Poirot was already fully dressed, shoes gleaming, moustache trimmed to near mathematical precision. Something is wrong, he said simply. I nodded. I've not seen Alice, and the hallway's been empty since dawn. It was then that Gerard Venn emerged from the stairs, looking pale and distracted. Is everything quite all right? I asked him. I don't know, he stammered. I knocked on Evelyn's door just now. No answer. Why were you knocking? Poirot asked sharply. I heard a noise in the night, he replied, like something heavy falling. I thought perhaps, I just thought I'd check. Without a word, Poirot swept past us and knocked crisply on Evelyn's door. No response. He knocked again, louder. Then, without waiting for permission, he turned the handle and stepped inside. The room was dim, curtains still drawn. The air smelled faintly of lavender, and something else. Evelyn lay on the bed, unnaturally still. I rushed to her side while Poirot remained at the threshold, eyes scanning the room. She's breathing, I said, but it's shallow, very shallow. Poirot moved to the small table by the bed. On it stood a teacup, a silver spoon resting inside, and beside it, an unstoppered glass bottle, half full the day before, now empty. He picked it up and examined the label. Laudanum, he said grimly, but heavily diluted. This was not administered in error, it was planned, carefully. You think someone drugged her deliberately? Poirot gave me a pointed look. What better way to make a woman appear unstable than to rob her of her clarity? One's mind becomes fogged. Dreams invade the waking hours. Truth and illusion blur. He paced slowly, fingertips pressed together. To the world, she will seem increasingly erratic, unreliable, perhaps even mad. You think someone wants her out of the way? Non, he said. Worse. Someone wishes her to lose all credibility, to doubt herself. And then when the time is right, he snapped his fingers. They will act, but I will act first. As he spoke, his voice grew sharper, more focused. Hastings, I believe we have moved beyond whispers and dreams. We are now in the territory of premeditated cruelty, and I do not like it. And with that, he turned, leaving Evelyn to rest, while the storm he had been waiting for finally began to break. Poirot had always said that the smallest shift in a person's behavior, an unnecessary gesture, a misplaced hesitation, was often more revealing than fingerprints or footprints. As the rain continued to fall over the Surrey countryside, he announced his next phase of investigation with characteristic flair. "It is time," he declared, "for the little grey cells to do their dance, Hastings." "I thought they danced constantly," I replied, though I knew exactly what he meant. Poirot would now turn from rooms and objects to the human mind, the place he considered the most treacherous crime scene of all. One by one, the inhabitants of Willowbank guest house were invited to speak with him in the small morning room. I observed as Poirot transformed from eccentric guest to astute interrogator. He sat in the centre of the room, hands folded, moustache immaculate, voice gentle but razor sharp. He began not with accusations, but with empathy. "It is not always the guilty who suffer, madame," he said to Cecily Fairburn as she sat before him. "Sometimes it is the innocent, when they carry the burden of silence." She looked surprised, even moved. "You think I'm suffering?" "I think you know more than you wish to admit. To me, that is the mark of someone who fears truth, not guilt." Later, he met with Gérard Venn, whose discomfort grew with each question. "You did not remember Evelyn, monsieur," Poirot said delicately, "and yet a flower you once catalogued was found in her room." Venn's ears turned pink. Perhaps I did know her, years ago, in passing." "Ah, déjà, we upgrade from never to in passing," Poirot said mildly. "Memory is a curious thing, non? Especially when it concerns a lady." By the end of the day, Poirot had spoken with every major figure in the house. Each emerged from the room looking slightly unsettled, as if they had gone in with a story and come out with a question. "Do you have a theory yet?" I asked. Poirot simply tapped his temple. "It is forming, mon ami. Like steam gathering upon the mirror, it shall clear soon enough." It was the following morning that Poirot asked to speak privately with Howard Lowndes once more. We found him in the study, arranging papers at a writing desk with the air of a man whose world was unravelling in tiny increments. "My dear monsieur," Poirot began, "thank you for indulging me again. I am a man of precision, and when a matter is not aligned, I itch to correct it." Howard smiled faintly. "You'll have to forgive my lack of patience, Poirot. This whole affair has taken a toll on us all." "Indeed," Poirot nodded. "Especially on your wife, no?" Howard's gaze shifted. "Evelyn has always been prone to melancholy. This episode, it's nothing new. Her dreams, her fears, they come and go." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And you find it convenient to leave them unexplored?" Howard's smile froze. "What exactly are you suggesting? That her condition is perhaps not as spontaneous as it appears?" Howard stiffened. "You think someone's done this to her?" "Non, monsieur. I think someone has allowed it to happen, encouraged it, perhaps even orchestrated it. I'd never harm Evelyn." "No," said Poirot, tilting his head. "But perhaps you might quietly hope she would no longer be a complication." Howard stood abruptly. "I've done nothing wrong." "Yet you altered your will," Poirot said smoothly. "Recently, in fact. Your solicitor confirmed as much." Howard's composure cracked. "That's none of your concern." "But it is, monsieur. When a man changes his inheritance, when a wife becomes unstable, and when an heirloom vanishes, these things become threads in the same tapestry." "You have no proof," Howard said flatly. Poirot offered a small smile. "Perhaps not, but I see the patterns, monsieur. I see the hesitation in your words, the flicker in your eye. You are not a man at ease. When we left the room, I turned to Poirot. Do you really think he's involved? He is involved, Hastings, Poirot said quietly. But whether he is the spider at the centre, or merely one who dances to another's tune, that remains to be seen. Of all the residents at Willowbank, Mrs. Felicity Lowndes was the one I found hardest to read. Her elegance was as hard and polished as marble, unbending, without flaw, but perhaps, I thought, just as cold. Poirot, naturally, had noticed what I had missed. He requested a second interview with her, and this time there was no tea. She met us in the conservatory, standing by the long window that overlooked the mist-shrouded garden. Monsieur Poirot, she said coolly. Still chasing shadows, I see. Not shadows, madam, he replied, but reflections. They tell us far more, you know. She turned slightly, lips pressed into a line. What do you want? To understand you, madam. There's little to understand. I protect my family. I have done so for 25 years. Poirot nodded. Even when protection becomes control. She stared at him. Evelyn is not right for my son. She's not stable. I told Howard as much before he married her. Because of her sleep-talking. Because of her secrets. Poirot's voice was soft. And you have none, madame. That struck her. If you've come to accuse me of poisoning my daughter-in-law. Ah, no, Poirot interrupted, raising a hand. But I do wonder, who benefits most from Evelyn being silenced? Who is most threatened by her becoming awake? Mrs. Lowndes said nothing. Poirot pressed gently. A woman's influence over her son is a sacred thing, is it not? And yet, she must share him. She has taken everything from him, she whispered suddenly. She's drawn him away, made him doubt me. And so you wish her removed? I wish her gone, Mrs. Lowndes said quietly, but not like this. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Not like this. But perhaps, madam, you closed your eyes while someone else acted. She turned away from him, shoulders shaking slightly, and for the first time, I saw something almost like fragility in her. As we walked away, I said, that didn't sound like guilt. Poirot shook his head. No, Hastings, not guilt, but desperation. And desperation, too, can be dangerous. It was late afternoon when Poirot requested a second audience with Gerard Venn, the elusive botanist with an apparent aversion to straight answers. The man had spent the entire day in the greenhouse, a modest glass structure behind the orchard, surrounded by his ferns and field guides. Poirot didn't approach with accusation, but with curiosity. Monsieur Venn, he began as we stood beside a bed of monkshood, I admire your devotion to Flora. There is something soothing, is there not, about plants? They do not lie. Venn looked up, startled, as though he'd been addressed in a language he hadn't expected. They react to light and soil, he replied, brushing soil from his hands. Nothing more. Ah, but that is not nothing, Poirot said. They show their truth through growth or decay. Venn's brows knit, but he said nothing. Poirot pressed on gently. You told me you had never met Madame Evelyn before arriving at Willowbank. That's right, Venn replied, though he didn't meet Poirot's eye. And yet the dried chamomile flower in her room bore your label. A curious contradiction, n'est-ce pas? There was a pause. I must have sent it with something, he said vaguely. I used to give away pressed specimens before the war. It meant nothing. Perhaps, Poirot said. But names, Monsieur Venn, names mean a great deal, especially when a lady, half asleep, whispers the name of a man she was once treated by. Dr. Callum Marsh, a colleague of yours, was he not? Venn looked sharply at Poirot. We were at the same recovery centre, he said. A military hospital converted for psychiatric cases. Marsh was clinical staff. I was a patient. I blinked. You? Ven's jaw tensed. Shell shock. I was barely 20, Poirot softened slightly. That time marked you, as it did many. And Madame Evelyn, was she also there? She volunteered as a nurse, quiet, kind. She would bring books to the gardens, read aloud. Poirot said nothing for a long moment. Then gently, "Did you love her?" Ven looked away. "It wasn't like that." "But you remember her?" "Yes," he said finally. "She was the only piece I knew." As we walked away, Poirot whispered, "Love, Hastings, unspoken, buried in shame and yet still blooming years later. A flower pressed in memory." Cecily Fairburn was, by all appearances, a woman in control of her narrative. She walked with confidence, smiled with precision, and answered questions with the ease of someone accustomed to polite scrutiny. But on that rainy evening, Poirot asked to speak with her again, and this time the facade began to crack. We found her in the library, curled in an armchair with a mystery novel on her lap. She looked up, slightly startled, but recovered quickly. "Back for more questions, Monsieur Poirot?" she asked with a smile. "Oui, madame, but only a few. You are very generous with your time." She shrugged. "It's a small house. There's nowhere else to be." Poirot took the seat opposite her, fingers steepled. "You were very close to Evelyn, were you not?" "Yes, since school." "And yet," he said, tilting his head, "you seem to know very little about her dreams. You avoid speaking of them." Cecily blinked. "I've told you all I know. Evelyn's never shared much of her inner world. She's always been private." "Ah, but you see," Poirot said gently, "I do not believe that. I believe she trusted you." Once her composure slipped a fraction. "What are you implying?" "That you know more than you are willing to say." Cecily looked away, fiddling with a thread on her sleeve. Poirot continued, his voice softer now. "When a woman like Madame Evelyn begins to speak names in her sleep, names linked to the past, it is not merely dreaming, it is remembering. And you, Madame, are not surprised by these names. You are afraid of them." Her hands stilled. "She burned letters," Poirot added quietly. "Letters you gave her, or perhaps ones you tried to take back." "I didn't want to hurt her," Cecily said suddenly. "She's fragile. I thought if I reminded her of what happened, it would break her." "What happened, Madame?" Cecily looked at him, eyes wide. "Tell me," Poirot said softly. "Because if you do not, someone else will, and they may be far less kind." She closed her eyes. "It wasn't just a friendship. We were sisters, not by blood, but by what we endured, what we survived. Evelyn tried to forget it. I never could." As we left the room, Poirot said quietly, "There are many kinds of secrets, Hastings. Some we bury to protect others. Some we bury to protect ourselves." That night, as the house creaked under the weight of storm and memory, Poirot asked me to accompany him to the servants' quarters, a humble corridor behind the main staircase that most guests never even saw. He knocked gently on the door of Alice, Evelyn's maid. The young woman answered in her nightdress, startled but polite. "Forgive the intrusion, mademoiselle," Poirot said kindly. "But I have one more question." Alice nodded. "Of course. It is about the other night, the night Madame Evelyn was found, unusually drowsy." Alice looked down. "Yes, sir. You told me Mrs. Lowndes was seen entering the room late. Was she carrying anything?" Alice hesitated. "A teacup." "Ah," Poirot said softly. "Not on a tray?" "No, sir. Just a cup. I remember because I thought it odd. She never brings Evelyn her tea. That's always me." Poirot's moustache twitched. "And did she say anything to you?" "She told me to stay in my room. Said Evelyn was sleeping and didn't want to be disturbed." "Merci, mademoiselle. You have been most helpful." As we walked back toward the main hall, Poirot was uncharacteristically silent. She drugged her, didn't she? I said. She brought the cup, yes, Poirot replied. But whether she filled it, that is another matter entirely. You mean someone else might have done it? Poirot's eyes narrowed. We must not assume, Hastings. Not yet. A woman may carry poison in her hand, but it does not mean she placed it there. He paused at the bottom of the stairs, gazing up into the darkened house. There are more layers here, mon ami, and we are only now brushing the surface. The storm that had threatened all week finally broke over Willowbank that night. Rain lashed the windows and thunder rolled like distant gunfire. Yet within the drawing room, Poirot sat in a calm pocket of stillness, the firelight dancing across his face as he questioned Cecily Fairburn for the third time. I must ask you again, madam, he said softly, about the letters. Cecily's hands gripped the arms of the chair. I told you, I never read them. But you saw them, Poirot said, voice firm now. And you saw Evelyn burn them, n'est-ce pas? She nodded, almost imperceptibly. It was the day before we read of Dr. Marsh's death, she said. I found her in the drawing room. The fire was lit, though it was early spring. She was kneeling beside it, feeding something in, pages, envelopes. She looked up at me, eyes full of tears, and said only, It's over now. Poirot leaned forward. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? I didn't think it mattered. It was personal. It always matters, madame, he said gravely. The mind suppresses. The heart tries to forget. But fire, fire remembers nothing. It is the perfect accomplice. Cecily looked miserable. She was trying to let go, that's all, to burn the past. And yet, Poirot murmured, when the past burns, it often releases more smoke than heat. As we stepped into the hall, I turned to him. You think Marsh's death was tied to those letters? I think, Poirot replied, that someone else believed it was, and that someone wanted to be certain those letters would never speak again. It was well past midnight when Poirot knocked on my door. He was fully dressed, eyes sharp beneath the dim glow of the oil lamp he carried. Hastings, my friend, he said, come. We must conduct a little search. I followed him down the corridor, still tugging on my dressing gown. Is this entirely legal? Mais oui, Poirot said with a sly smile. Madame Cecily gave me permission to examine her room, though she did not know when I would avail myself of it. With the door unlocked, we stepped inside the room Cecily had occupied since her coincidental arrival at Willowbank. Everything was in order. Too much so, perhaps. Poirot made a slow circuit, pausing only once, at a writing desk tucked neatly beneath the window. He opened the top drawer. Inside were a stack of stationery sheets, a pair of silver-rimmed spectacles, and folded inside a novel, a photograph. Poirot drew it out with a delicate hand. I gasped. That's Evelyn. She was seated on a garden bench, her smile serene, but it was the man beside her who drew all the air from the room. Young, fair-haired, eyes glancing toward her rather than the camera, Dr. Callum Marsh. But the photograph had been torn in two, and only rejoined by a crude strip of yellowed tape. Poirot studied it for a long moment. It was once destroyed, he said. But then, perhaps in a moment of regret, repaired. Curious, is it not? But why hide it in a book? Because this, Poirot said, holding it up, is no longer memory. It is evidence. I frowned. You think they were lovers? Not merely that, Poirot said. I believe they shared something more powerful, a secret, one worth hiding, one that someone else may have wanted buried. He slipped the photograph into his pocket. The pieces, Hastings, he whispered. They are nearly in place. But now, now we must arrange them. The drawing room of Willowbank had never felt more like a stage. The lamps cast a warm, theatrical glow across the polished floor, and each of the players had taken their seat, some stiff with indignation, others resigned, like passengers on a ship they knew was already sinking. At the centre stood Poirot. He looked immaculate, as always. Grey suit sharp as a scalpel, his moustache glinting faintly in the lamplight. He placed one hand behind his back, the other raised in a gesture of quiet command. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, voice smooth and unhurried, "I thank you for your presence this evening. You are no doubt aware that something has been amiss within this house. Madame Evelyn, our dear hostess, has been plagued by strange dreams, words spoken in sleep, names murmured, a brooch vanished, a bottle emptied. These were not, I assure you, disconnected incidents." No one spoke. Poirot let the silence stretch before continuing. "I have summoned you here not to speculate, but to explain. Because you see, I have solved your little mystery. It began, as such things often do, with a whisper, a name, a secret in her sleep." Howard Lowndes shifted in his chair, jaw tight. Cecily stared at the fireplace, unmoving. Mrs. Lowndes had folded her arms like a schoolmistress waiting to issue a punishment. Poirot turned toward Evelyn, who sat to one side, pale but composed. "Madame, you have suffered. Not only in recent days, but years ago, during the war. You sought to forget, but the mind, it does not always obey the heart. And when a trauma is left unresolved, it returns, often at night, when our guard is down." He turned slowly, addressing them all. "I propose to show you one by one how each piece of this tragic little puzzle fits together. And when we arrive at the final corner, then we shall see the whole image. And it is not as innocent as some might wish." I admit I felt a chill then. Not from the fire, but from the precision in Poirot's voice. Something important was coming. Something final. Poirot began to pace, his footsteps soft against the carpet, his hands now clasped behind his back. It would be easy to say that Evelyn was simply unwell, that her dreams were the result of strain or a nervous disposition. Many have said so, perhaps even believed it. He turned abruptly toward Mrs. Lowndes. "But that belief was encouraged, was it not, madame? Nurtured even?" Mrs. Lowndes bristled. "I only looked after her as any concerned mother would." "Ah," Poirot nodded. "But it was not concern that guided your hand when you brought the teacup to her bedside. It was conviction. You believed she was dangerous, that she had come to your house with the intention of stealing your son." "I never—" Poirot held up a hand. "Please, madame, let us not pretend. You saw her as an intruder, an unworthy wife, a fragile woman, easily discredited." He stepped to the small side table, where earlier that day he had arranged the key evidence. There, beside the typed note and the torn photograph, stood the now empty bottle of laudanum. She was not ill. She was made to seem so. Each evening, a little more of this was added to her tea. Enough to confuse her thoughts, to muddle her memory, but not enough to kill. "No, madame, you are too clever for that. You merely wished her to appear unstable." "I never meant to hurt her," Mrs. Lowndes said through clenched teeth. "She was upsetting everything. My son's life, his judgment. He couldn't see what she was doing, manipulating him." "Manipulation," Poirot echoed. "Yes, that is the word of the hour, and yet I do not believe you acted alone." Howard Lowndes sat straighter. "Are you accusing my mother?" "I am accusing you both," Poirot said sharply. "You, monsieur, were the architect. You manipulated your mother's fears. You encouraged her suspicions. But the idea, it was yours." Howard paled. "You needed Evelyn gone, quietly, permanently, and if she could be made to seem mad, Committed. Who would believe her? Who would challenge your inheritance? The will you changed not long ago, oui? Mais non, monsieur, Poirot said, holding up a finger. We shall come to you soon enough. But first, let us go back in time. Poirot turned his attention now to Cecily Fairburn, whose composure had begun to crack. You have known Evelyn the longest, he said gently. You were not only her friend, you were her witness, her mirror, and perhaps her rival. Cecily's eyes narrowed. That's not fair. But truth is rarely fair, madame. It is simply true. He held up the torn photograph, the image of Evelyn and Dr. Marsh, taped together with shaky hands. This, Poirot said, was hidden in your belongings. A memory you could not part with, a proof you could not bear to destroy. Cecily stood. You think I drugged her too? No, he said calmly. You wanted her to face it, to remember. You came here not to harm her, but to force her to look backward, because you could not move forward. Cecily sank back into her chair, silent. Poirot returned to the centre of the room. During the war, Dr. Marsh was both healer and beloved. He and Evelyn were close, too close for some. She was young, vulnerable, traumatized by what she had seen. And when the war ended, she tried to forget. He, perhaps, did not. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. His death, a month ago, officially ruled a suicide, was the trigger. Evelyn's dreams began not by chance, but in response. The name Marsh returned to her because she had never truly let it go. I shifted uncomfortably. Do you think she felt guilty? Poirot nodded slowly. Guilt, shame, grief. These emotions are not so easily compartmentalized. And when someone you once cared for dies by their own hand, well, Hastings, even sleep is no refuge. He turned back to the room. And someone here knew that. Knew what Marsh meant to Evelyn. Knew how to use it to make her unravel. His gaze landed firmly, unmistakably, on Howard. You feared her past would destroy your reputation, monsieur. But in truth, it has destroyed your mask. Poirot now turned toward the side table once more, where the ruby-encrusted brooch lay in its velvet-lined case, recently recovered and damning in its implications. He gestured toward it with a flourish, like a magician revealing the final card. And now, he said, let us discuss this delicate object, the brooch. A family heirloom, yes, of considerable value, monetary and sentimental. Mrs. Lowndes nodded tersely. It belonged to my husband's grandmother. And yet it went missing, Poirot continued. Not from a drawer left ajar, not from an unlocked case, but from a locked box, a key, I should remind you, kept only by Madame Evelyn. His tone shifted, sharpened slightly. And where was it found? Not with Evelyn, nor in her room. It was discovered, conveniently, tucked inside the seam of Cecily Fairbairn's travel case. All eyes turned to Cecily, who stiffened but said nothing. Poirot gave a slight bow. You will forgive me, mademoiselle, for having asked the maid to check. A small deceit on my part, yes, but necessary. He let the silence linger, the tension coil tighter. Now, he continued, to the casual observer, this discovery would cast immediate suspicion. Cecily, the visitor from Evelyn's past, conveniently present in a time of confusion and fear. Perhaps seeking revenge, perhaps trying to destabilize the household. But Poirot raised a finger. Only if one accepts the brooch was hers to begin with. He stepped closer to Howard Lowndes. Tell me, monsieur, do you recall the moment when you found the brooch? Howard's jaw tightened. I did. In Cecily's bag. I thought it suspicious. But you hoped it would be found there? Poirot corrected. You planted it. You took it from your wife's case when she was sedated, and you hid it among Cecily's things, knowing it would raise doubt. A gasp came from Mrs. Lowndes. But why? She asked. Why frame Cecily? Because, said Poirot gravely, if suspicion fell on Cecily, attention would be diverted from the one person truly responsible for Evelyn's condition, Howard himself. He nodded toward the brooch. It was never about the jewel. It was a trap, a distraction. But even the cleverest trap leaves footprints. For a moment, all was still. Cecily sat frozen, her face pale but no longer guarded. Poirot turned to her once more, but now his voice had softened again. And yet, mademoiselle, he said, you are not quite who you appear to be, are you? Cecily raised her chin. I've told you the truth. Non, madame. You have told me a truth, a partial one, convenient, polished. He retrieved a second document from his pocket, a folded letter, yellowed at the edges, a birth record. I had my associate in London make a few inquiries, and here we find something very curious indeed. He opened it carefully, reading aloud. Cecily Marianne Fairburn, born Cecily Marianne Marsh, father, Robert Marsh, mother, Miriam Ashcroft. At the mention of Marsh, Evelyn stirred in her seat. Poirot continued gently. Robert Marsh, also the father of Evelyn Louns. Different mothers, yes, but the same blood. Cecily's face turned scarlet. You came not only as a friend, Poirot said softly, but as family, a sister, a half-sister disowned perhaps, forgotten more likely. And you came with questions and with bitterness. It wasn't about the money, Cecily said through clenched teeth. Not just the money. I wanted to understand. Why did she get everything? The name, the house, the history? I got nothing. You wanted recognition, Poirot said. And when you didn't receive it, when Evelyn didn't even remember, you became angry. I never hurt her, Cecily snapped. No, Poirot nodded. But you did withhold. You saw her spiraling and said nothing. You let the sleeping pills flow and the letters burn because a part of you wanted her to suffer a little. Just enough. Cecily looked down, ashamed. It was not murder, Poirot said. Not quite. But it was cruelty, nonetheless. Then he turned back to the group at large. Ladies and gentlemen, what we see here is not a single villain. It is a web of secrets and regrets, each person pulling one thread tighter. He glanced at Evelyn, who sat now with her head bowed, her hands trembling in her lap. But the greatest cruelty, he said, was not from the past, but from the man who claimed to love her and sought to undo her mind, piece by piece. He looked directly at Howard. The next part, monsieur, is for you. Poirot stood silent for a long moment, letting the atmosphere curdle into stillness. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock near the fireplace, each second louder than the last. Then, at last, he turned his gaze fully on Howard Lowndes. Et maintenant, monsieur, Poirot said, we speak of you, the gentleman in the mirror, the one who orchestrated the dance, while others merely followed the rhythm you provided. Howard gave a short, humourless laugh. Really, Poirot, you sound like a playwright. Indeed, Poirot replied. Then allow me to set the scene. He stepped forward, his voice sharp and unrelenting. You married Evelyn not for love, but for access to the family estate, to the respectability you desired. But when you learned of her past, her connection to Dr. Marsh, you feared scandal. A wife once involved with a wartime psychiatric patient. That would not do for your ambitions. I never, Poirot raised his voice. Let us not insult the intelligence, monsieur. The timing of Marsh's suicide, Evelyn's sleep-talking, your sudden trip to London, each so convenient. And when her memories began to resurface, when she spoke in her sleep, You saw an opportunity. He pointed toward the laudanum bottle. You encouraged your mother to dose her tea, citing Evelyn's delicate nerves. You planted seeds of doubt in the minds of all around her. A little instability here, a whisper of madness there. A clever scheme, non? Death by reputation. I didn't want her dead, Howard snapped. I just wanted… What you always wanted, Poirot interrupted. Control. The words hung in the air, heavy as lead. You changed your will. You orchestrated the theft of the brooch. You manipulated your mother, your wife, even Mademoiselle Cecily. Howard stood then, his hands clenched at his sides. You can't prove any of this. Ah, Poirot said with a sigh. But that is the beauty of such schemes. They are not undone by fingerprints, but by flaws in the character. A man so consumed by fear cannot help but act before others. And you, monsieur, you acted too soon. Poirot took a step back and looked around the room. It is over. The game has been played, and you, Howard Lowndes, have lost. The silence that followed Poirot's pronouncement was not immediate outrage, nor shock. It was the stunned stillness of a truth settling into place. Evelyn sat motionless, her face as pale as the handkerchief clutched in her lap. Cecily stared at the floor, her lips parted. Mrs. Lowndes had begun to cry quietly into a folded handkerchief. Whether from guilt or humiliation, it was hard to say. It was Hastings who finally spoke. So, all of this. It wasn't madness. Poirot turned to me gently, with a faint smile. Non, mon ami. It was clarity disguised as chaos. What Madame Evelyn experienced was not the disintegration of her mind, but its struggle to surface through the fog imposed upon it. He looked back to the assembled company. You see, ladies and gentlemen, this crime, this masterpiece of misdirection, was not written in blood, but in whispers, in subtle gestures, in glances, in the unspoken. It was psychological, emotional, and all the more cruel for it. He walked slowly to Evelyn and bowed his head. Madame, they tried to take your reality from you, piece by piece, but even as you slept, the soul remembered. The truth, your truth, remained. Evelyn's eyes brimmed with tears. I thought I was going mad. No, madame, Poirot said. You were not the one dreaming. It was he turned sharply toward Howard, who dreamed of wealth, of reputation, of a future forged upon your erasure. Poirot straightened, drawing his lapels neatly as he moved again to the centre of the room. This case has reminded me of something, mon ami, he said to me. The mind is a fortress, but even a fortress may be breached from within. The greatest harm is not always dealt by enemies, but by those who smile as they poison. I swallowed hard, watching Howard as he stood silently, his face grey. Poirot gave a final, eloquent shrug. It was not the lady who dreamed, he said softly, but the gentleman who plotted, with remarkable cowardice. He turned back to Evelyn one last time. Justice will be done, madame, not just in the courts, but here, tonight, where truth has been reclaimed. And with that, Hercule Poirot sat down, folded his hands upon his lap, and closed his eyes. The case, as far as he was concerned, was now complete. The drawing room had quieted, though the air still pulsed with the weight of revelation. Howard sat slumped, his hands clasped together, staring into the fire as if hoping to disappear into its embers. Cecily had withdrawn to the far corner, pale and tight-lipped, and Mrs. Lowndes was seated stiffly on the chaise, her expression unreadable. Poirot, ever precise, stood once more and walked to a small writing desk in the corner. With the care of a man unsealing a time capsule, he opened the top drawer and produced a worn leather-bound book, a volume of poetry Evelyn had kept by her bedside. In times of turmoil, he said, turning toward Evelyn, we often return to objects of comfort, a book, a trinket, a photograph, but sometimes, madame, Those objects returned to us, with truths we did not know they carried. He opened the book to a dog-eared page and drew out a single sheet of folded paper, yellowed at the creases. With elegant flair, he handed it to Evelyn. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the page. "What is it?" I asked quietly. Poirot turned to the room. A letter from Dr. Callum Marsh. Evelyn's breath caught. Written in the neat, slanted hand of a careful man, the letter was brief but devastatingly clear. "Dearest Evelyn, if this letter ever reaches you, I can only pray it is with peace in your life and clarity in your heart. I am sorry for the burden you carried alone, for my silence, and for allowing my fear to become your shadow. Should anything happen to me, know this. You were never mad. Not then, not now. You were the only one who saw the world with unclouded eyes, even when we were surrounded by madness. I have enclosed the records you asked for, sealed, as promised. Let them be your shield if ever you need it. Callum." Evelyn sank slowly into her chair, her eyes brimming. "I never knew. I thought I'd burned everything. But I must have hidden this, years ago." Poirot's voice was gentle. "Subconsciously, madame, you knew. You protected yourself, without even realizing it." The letter, Poirot explained, included confidential notes from Marsh's time at the hospital, notes confirming Evelyn's sound mental state and discrediting any claims of delusion or instability. "It is the final nail," he said, turning toward Howard, "in the coffin of your deceit." The next hour passed with an uncanny stillness, broken only by the sound of Poirot telephoning the local constable. Howard sat without speaking, no longer protesting, no longer performing. Something in him had collapsed, as if the final thread of his illusion had snapped. It was I who opened the door when Inspector Graves arrived, an austere man with a soft voice and sharp eyes. "Evening, Mr. Poirot," the inspector said, removing his gloves. "You've quite stirred the hive this time, haven't you?" "Ah, Inspector," Poirot replied. The hive was already buzzing. I merely pointed to the queen wasp. Graves approached Howard with measured steps. "Howard Lowndes," he said, "I'm placing you under arrest on suspicion of attempted fraud, conspiracy to commit medical misdiagnosis, and psychological harm with intent to defraud." Howard looked up, blinking like a man waking from a long sleep. "I didn't mean to ruin her." "But you did," Graves said flatly. Poirot stepped forward one last time. "You were not mad, monsieur," he said. "You were not even desperate. You were deliberate. And now you must face what you tried so hard to escape. Accountability." Howard offered no resistance. As the constable led him away, Evelyn looked down at the letter in her lap, still not fully grasping the weight that had lifted. Cecily crossed the room, kneeling beside her. "I never meant for it to go so far," she whispered. "I just wanted to be seen." Evelyn met her gaze. "You were. We both were. By the wrong man." Poirot said nothing. He simply moved to the fireplace, brushing a speck of ash from the mantel with his handkerchief. As Hastings and I followed him out into the hallway, he murmured, "The mind, Hastings. It forgets many things, but cruelty. It remembers, even in sleep." After the constables had taken Howard away and the house had settled into a thick, contemplative silence, Evelyn remained seated near the fire, still clutching the letter that had restored her name, her truth, and, in many ways, her soul. Poirot stood at her side, not as a detective now, but as something quieter, more human. There was a rare softness in his gaze, as if the unmasking of the villain had left behind a residue of sorrow rather than triumph. Evelyn spoke at last, her voice little more than a breath. "I thought I was losing my mind, Monsieur Poirot. Night after night. The dreams, the confusion, the fear of what I might say without knowing. I began to doubt if I had ever known myself. Poirot bowed his head slightly. You were not lost, madame. You were obscured. By fear. By the manipulations of others. But never lost. She looked up at him then, her eyes filled with tears that had waited far too long to fall. I should have seen it, she whispered. But I wanted to believe him. I thought love would protect me. Poirot knelt beside her chair with deliberate grace. Ah, madam. Love. It is the greatest deceiver of all. Not because it lies, but because it makes us willing to believe even the most dangerous truths. Evelyn gave a small, bitter laugh, then leaned forward and wept. Not with hysteria, but with the quiet grief of a woman who had finally been told she was not mad, not weak, and not alone. Poirot remained by her side in silence. In that moment, the great Hercule Poirot was no longer the world-famous detective, but simply a man offering kindness in the aftermath of cruelty. And I, standing nearby, could only marvel at the humanity beneath the moustache. Later that night, I found myself walking alone through the corridor outside my room, the house now dim and hushed. Somewhere, a clock chimed midnight. The mystery was solved. The villain unmasked. And yet, I could not stop thinking about Evelyn. Her voice in the night, those strange words spoken in sleep, and the long trail of memory they had unearthed. I found Poirot on the veranda, seated with his overcoat wrapped tightly about him, a small glass of cordial in hand. You are troubled, mon ami? He said without looking at me. Well, yes, I admitted. Not about the case. Heavens, you tied that up like a perfectly folded napkin. But about the beginning of it all. How did you know it wasn't madness? That it wasn't just nonsense in her sleep? Poirot gave a satisfied little grunt. Because, Hastings, nonsense is rarely so precise. The mind may dream of floating sheep or purple kangaroos. Yes, but names, warnings, secrets. These, my friend, do not rise from cheese eaten too late at night. They come from a mind at war with itself, a mind fighting to remember. But she was unconscious, drugged, half asleep. Ah, Poirot said, wagging a finger. But even in that fog, the soul will whisper what the tongue dares not speak. He sipped his cordial, eyes twinkling. Sleep, Hastings, is a veil. But sometimes it is also a mirror. And though I didn't quite understand what he meant, I knew better than to press him. Not tonight. The next morning arrived with the soft scent of rain and the gentle rustling of the garden hedges. Willowbank seemed lighter somehow, as if it too had been exorcised of something dark and unseen. As I packed our cases for departure, Poirot was handed a telegram by the housemaid, Alice, her hands still dusted with flour from breakfast scones. Poirot read it, and his eyebrows lifted with the slightest quiver of interest. He folded the slip neatly and tucked it into his pocket. Well? I asked, ever the impatient Watson to his Holmes. Good news? He smiled faintly, but there was something behind it, something unreadable. A patient, he said. From the St. Ives Sanatorium, formerly in a coma. He awoke this morning. His first words were... Poirot paused, as though amused. Evelyn's name. I blinked. Dr. Marsh. Poirot gave a slight nod, already reaching for his gloves and walking stick. Some stories, Hastings, are not so easily ended. They merely... pause. He opened the front door and turned once more toward the house, offering it a small bow, as if in farewell to a stage well played. As we stepped out onto the gravel drive, he added almost as an afterthought. Sleep, mon ami, is a most curious state. It buries truth, yes, but sometimes it also plants it, and in time, it blooms. I followed him in silence, suitcase in hand, wondering what would bloom next, when the dream truly ended, and what might yet be whispered. in sleep. And so, another curtain falls on a mystery where shadows were cast not by violence, but by manipulation, cowardice, and the subtle poisons of the mind. As always, Poirot reminded us that the truth is not buried in blood or fingerprints, but in behavior, fear, and the lies people tell themselves. In the end, even sleep could not hide what the little grey cells were destined to uncover. As Poirot would say, "The human mind, mon ami, it leaves traces even when the feet do not." To which I might add, if this is what people murmur in their sleep, perhaps it's safer I start wearing earplugs. What do you think was the real turning point in the case? The moment Poirot truly knew the culprit? Was it the planted brooch, the hidden letter, or something else entirely? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this classic Hercule Poirot mystery, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more thrilling detective stories to life every single week. Stay sharp, mes amis. More mysteries await.